just going to continue there by starting with the point that the psychedelic industry has been calling for the urgency of increased psychedelic access for minority groups. But access, we argue, is dangerous when harmful healing ideologies are so widely accepted and unexamined in the broader field. Psychedelic exceptionalism, as defined by Matthew Johnson, is one of the greatest sources of harm that I have been seeing. It overlooks the danger of psychedelics as cultogenic. They have an explicit history of giving rise to cultish groups. In Matt's definition, he says that the belief that psychedelics are so sacred and important that the normal rules of ethics in clinical practice do not apply. But this is paired with insufficient attention to the fact that during decades in the underground, many of these groups were insulated from outside scrutiny of their practices. Many of those practices are already associated with predictable patterns of harm that will disproportionately impact vulnerable groups if they scale with endorsement from government regulators. To address these risks, we have to pay attention to abuses of power in the field itself. We need to change the field's norms so that people with important perspectives can come forward. To help illustrate what I mean, I'll very quickly share some of my experiences of challenging Lykos's application of the recent FDA advisory committee meeting where Ife Tayo also spoke. In my analysis that I submitted to the FDA, I argue that MAPS qualifies as a therapy cult with an overly rigid healing ideology. The full analysis is on my Substack in a post titled MAPS is an MDMA therapy cult if you'd like to know more of the details. I presented evidence that MAPS obscured its actual therapy protocol from regulators, and that this undisclosed protocol introduces unexamined and unnecessary risks. The takeaway is that MAPS's healing ideology encourages boundary violations, and it introduces a vocabulary that invalidates participant articulations of harm. This creates a high risk of re-traumatization, especially for those with trauma related to invalidation, including racial and ethnic minorities, LGBTQ+ individuals, and people who have experienced sexual assault and coercive control. In the week after I submitted my analysis to the FDA, 3 separate predictions that I made based on close reading descriptions of their healing ideology were confirmed. Multiple participants told me my analysis validated their experiences of harm. They shared that MAPS-trained therapists had conditioned them to believe that they were at fault for new traumas that those therapists caused. So far, the broader field has not acknowledged these risks in the post-advisory committee commentary. But a few days ago, I was singled out in an open letter published by multiple veterans groups. These groups have received significant funding by the Psychedelic Science Funders Collaborative. The letter, which is full of inaccuracies, includes, quote, Ms. Devno and her colleagues at ICER and Symposia have successfully manipulated the media and infiltrated the FDA's regulatory process to the detriment of millions. They may single-handedly dash the hopes of thousands of veterans who continue to take their own lives due to their suffering from PTSD. Today, writing in Ecstatic Integration, Jules Evans identified how this rhetoric is dangerous. He wrote, quote, this PR strategy is pretty unpleasant in its targeting of one woman. It might even be unsafe if you're telling desperate and occasionally armed veterans, this woman is wishing you hate and perpetuating your suffering, end quote. Nonetheless, this open letter was shared by major funders in the psychedelic industry, including Tim Ferriss, Steve Yurvitson, and David Bronner. Many of these investors are associated with the Psychedelic Science Funders Collaborative. At least one of them even funded Poplar here at Harvard's Petrie-Flom. This is ultimately why I spoke up, because people are afraid, because the industry has a history of making examples of people who talk about harm. That is why I needed to be a proxy for whistleblowers in the first place. And ultimately, it should not be on individuals to deal with these dynamics. The field can speak up and not require me to take all of this threat to my personal safety. Ethicists can help by acknowledging the validity of part of my analysis, for example, and actually addressing it, rather than focusing on the easier to excuse aspects like functional binding. And I think that the more that we do that, the more we'll have other perspectives to drive the field forward in a way that is not putting the greatest harms on the most vulnerable patients. Thank you.
Leonard.
Nishay, do you think it would be best to, if one has a critique of an organization, to approach the organization privately and discuss how to reform their approaches or their research or their techniques? Or is it better to go online and go public with a critique first?
Ultimately, I have been doing my critical work for very many years, and I needed to start becoming, because I studied, in the beginning I wanted to study trip reports. I'm a literary scholar, and I have things that I would rather be doing with my time, frankly, than talking about these critical safety issues. But I have noticed over the years, trying to raise these issues privately, that I was, and other people who also tried to speak up, were systematically marginalized and excluded from the conversations. And so for the field to look at those who have been excluded and marginalized, speaking up at a very high stakes time when there's an attempt to scale these practices and trying to say, it's important that we do this right from the beginning, because we might not get a second chance. I think that that's completely valid given the circumstances, but I do speak in private, but those conversations haven't been public. You know, I definitely tried that. In my psychedelic hype / AI hype paper called Test Real Hallucinations, I talk about how the industry has really engaged in a bait and switch over many years, where it's like they're saying, don't question what we're doing, we have to move quickly and break things because this is so important to address climate change and rising rates of political polarization and rising fascism and devastating impacts on mental health, when all of those things are actually connected to rising rates of inequality in society. So if we actually make an industry that's just creating new billionaires and new unicorn corporations, that's actually fueling the root cause of the problems that we're talking about in the first place, and that's an important aspect of the conversation. And just to answer the question about the psychedelic exceptionalism, I think it really relates to what I was talking about regarding the field's hostility to critique. And this actually comes up in meditation adverse event discourse as well, where it's there's, in both fields, there's certain groups that are too tightly held onto lineages of ideologies of healing that cannot be interrogated or questioned, even when they are the source of the harms. So it's we need to be able to have those questions and put forward hypotheses and scientific questions that can be tested empirically. But then when people are saying, I'm experiencing this harm and pointing to this is why that happened and we can address this and it's not necessary, those people, right now they're seen as threats to the millions of veterans whose blood will now be on their hands, explicitly. Whereas the field that I want to build thanks those people for coming forward. Thank you for sharing. You have helped us with looking on the beach for metal, you helped us find something that we can actually make safer so this doesn't need to happen again. And that is an overlooked component of healing. Because when people are able to take their suffering and their distress and do something meaningful with it to make the world safer for others, that can help them process their experience as well. And we're currently overlooking that whole aspect to healing.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking this panel.